Hello everybody, my name is Jack Caravanos and I'm a professor at NYU and also Director of Research at Pure Earth. The purpose of this presentation is to explain how we at Pure Earth have apportioned global lead risk and primarily assigned it to certain risk factors. I'll go through this presentation, and if you have questions, feel free to contact myself or Rich Fuller on details. So how did I get started on all this was when I did a lead deposition study studying how much dust is settling on glass plates in New York metro area. Most of you know that New York City is quite dusty sometimes, and the question is how much of that dust, that surface dust on an automobile, on exterior surfaces, contains lead. And the surprising thing is after 2 years we were able to quantify a deposition rate of about 32 micrograms per square foot per week depositing on surfaces in urban areas, specifically in New York City. That's rather shocking given that the standard is 40 micrograms per square foot for indoor lead dust deposition. Then we asked the question, where is this stuff coming from? And we did some spatial exterior dust lead loadings in New York City, and we found some rather startling numbers. Again, I'm not saying that the surface of every horizontal surface in New York has serious levels of lead dust, but we were able to measure some of this historic deposition in different parts of avenues in all of the 5 boroughs. And looking at some of these numbers, it is rather astounding how much lead dust there is settling in New York City air. Then, of course, the question is, where is this lead dust coming from? And we started looking at roadway grit and its relationship with elevated steel structures. And as you could expect, there's a good deal of painted steel structures that contain lead-based paint, and we found fairly high levels in roadway grit. This is the sandy, gritty material on roads and sidewalks, and we found that very high levels existed under steel structures, which led us, of course, to suspect that paint like this does chip off, crumble, becomes part of urban grit, and is quite measurable. Cars mobilize this, causing lead dust to be settled not only on surfaces, but also interior surfaces in homes. Now, the pathway from lead is historically thought to be this, meaning lead-based paint simply is ingested as a paint chip by a child. Well, we understand now that this is unlikely the case for most poisonings, that kids don't really just hunt down lead paint chips and eat them like candy. Now, most of that lead paint chips become household dust by crumbling, pulverizing, and just crushing. And whether this is outdoor by automobiles or inside a home, a good deal of the paint gets broken down and part of household dust. Of course, lead-based paint can also fall off a building into soil and then either be directly ingested by a child playing in that soil or by the lead-contaminated soil becoming part of household dust. However, Pure Earth and I have been studying this for many years, and we see a lot of this going on, that lead-contaminated soil, not related to paint, seems to be a major pathway either by contaminated household dust or direct ingestion. So the question is, where is this coming from? We've looked at many sites over the last 12 years. We have a database of about 3,000 sites. These have been individually assessed. We work in low and middle income countries, and you could see the website for more details on this. As far as myself, I've been to many countries, and I do extensive lead risk assessment in these countries with regard to sources. And overall, I'll come to the conclusion that I do not see lead-based paint in many of these countries. I do not see lead-based paint being a serious risk factor in many of these countries. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So these are some of the countries, these are the countries I've been to and have assessed. Again, when I get to some of these countries, whether personal travel or professional travel or even vacation, I usually somehow collect chips, bring them back for analysis, We have an XRF, we have lead check swabs, we have dust wipes. And again, I've been to many of these countries and just don't see the same lead-based paint conditions, deteriorated conditions, as I do in urban areas in New York, Philadelphia, and of course out west. This is just one example of a highly painted surface. One assumes a color like this must contain lead, but this is in Indonesia, in Chinanka, and we were doing lead risk assessment. We had lead poisoned kids, and we tested the school for lead-based paint and did not find any. And there's several reasons for that, and I'll get into it in a few minutes. But this is some staff people using an XRF to measure lead contamination. Whether it's brightly colored blue or green or reds, all these bright colors you see are lead-free paints. And all of these pictures you see here are taken within the last couple of years. This, in particular in Jakarta, was just last year, 2016. And there's several reasons for this, and essentially it is an expensive paint. But we were contracted and asked to do a lead-based paint assessment in many buildings in Jakarta, and this was about a year ago right now. You see myself testing a surface, and that yellow paint I'm testing in the center picture does contain lead-based paint. It's a very thin film of enamel paint on steel, which is part of a playground. However, it's in very good condition. The picture to the right of that is not lead-based paint, and also the picture on the bottom playing on the wood, the painted wood there, is not lead-based paint. So it was very intriguing how the same color yellow in a similar type of setting, one was positive, one was negative. Also on the top left you see Mark Taylor, Dr. Mark Taylor from Macquarie University in Australia, accompanied us to help us quantify this. In addition to XRFing, we did do lead dust wipes, and the data is still coming in. I believe we're up to about 105 establishments, homes, and daycares in the Jakarta metro area. But what we do see is this. This is a colleague of mine. He should not be smiling because that picture he's standing in front of is actually polyethylene battery plates, lead plates from automotive batteries that are used as shingles. These plastic plates have residual lead on them, lead oxide, and they're rather useful and they're waterproof. So this person actually ended up using it for a roofing material. And of course, here we are in Senegal, in an area historically that was lead contaminated from the use of batteries. But what I want you to focus on is notice the structures. None of them are painted. Lead paint in general, is expensive. It's very expensive worldwide, far more so than in the US, and especially lead-based paint. So lead paint is something of a luxury to many of these villages. And what we see here is really the contamination was the battery breaking that you see in the center of this picture. This is in Chéré-Soumer in Dakar, Senegal, and site of a well-known poisoning. So in all these countries I've been to, I always look for lead paint because that's where sort of my discipline comes from. And I'm sorry or happy to say that it does not appear anywhere near as prevalent as what the U.S. experience has been. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying as far as every home having lead-based paint that's peeling and chipping, very high levels, 5,000 ppm, 0.5% as defined by EPA, it's just not present. But the history of other sources of lead probably started with Tom Matei studying lead-acid battery workers in Jamaica who were breaking batteries. This is a very well-known study, and we have sort of continued that work. This is 129 sites in 3 countries where we quantified the lead risk from toxic waste sites, and most of these waste sites are legacy battery breaking. They're toxic sites where they're breaking batteries and then melting the terminals and smelting the oxide. We also then studied different countries. Here's 31 country study, quantifying the risk from 200 sites, 780,000 children, and some IQ loss here. These are all published in peer-reviewed journals. And our most recent work, some of the most recent work in Zambia, where we discovered a community, a city of 200,000 people and thousands of individuals exposed to very high levels of lead as a result of legacy lead mining in Zambia. Finally, we were able to do a meta-analysis of sorts of what is the background level, what's the anticipated background level in Mexico, and where is it coming from. And this was a study of 83 articles. We summed up the data and the blood lead levels depending on rural and urban and male and female. We see levels between 8 and 22 micrograms. And the data seems to bear this out, that lead risk is very high in Mexico, and the source here being primarily lead-based glaze. So why is this happening? Well, as I said, it's expensive paint. It's not available because it's been banned in the EU and banned in the USA. Banned in the EU decades now, many decades, and in the USA since 1978. So it is not easy paint to get a hold of. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is not easy. Why in the U.S. Did it take us so long to ban this? Well, the U.S. industry is vertically integrated, meaning the paint manufacturers own the paint pigment companies, own the chemical manufacturers, or had investments in them, and ultimately the lead mines. So it's very hard in the U.S. to ban lead-based paint, which is only banned residentially and not industrial paints. Because of this. In Europe, this was not the model, so it was much easier, much less resistance to ban lead-based paint in Europe because of this. And here's a good historic picture of Aspinall's enamel. I want you to look right in the middle. You'll see 1837 pictures of lead and oil, where lead used to be the colorant, lead carbonate, the white color of this paint. White lead, and then and this is an advertisement saying, hey, we have a new paint that's not made with lead and is non-poisonous. And this ad is 1897, 60 years after it was discovered the French pigment workers were suffering of lead poisoning in 1837. So there's a strong reason why Europe has never had the lead-based paint problem the U.S. has. So why do I say lead paint is not a primary global lead poisoning risk factor? Essentially, for you to have risk, you must have a hazard, and we do have lead, and you must have exposure. And you essentially find that lead-based paint is not very prevalent in residential housing. So even though the hazard is there, the exposure is not there. And by the way, the hazard is not very prevalent, whether it's our observations in Jakarta or in Ghana or in Zambia or in Peru. We just don't see colored lead-based paint pigments used in homes where it's deteriorating and peeling away. So with little exposure, you have little risk. We'll get back to this. So what do we think are the probable global sources of lead poisoning? In order of priority, our judgment and our years of working with this and being to literally dozens and dozens of sites. Batteries coming from informal and artisanal, so small scale recycling. These are either breaking a battery for the lead oxide or breaking it for the terminals and melting it down, making money. And this is a very a picture that I use all the time because it is an absolutely scary image of people sorting out these plates, scraping off the oxide, wearing the clothing, no real protection, and all that gray material you see around there is lead oxide, which may not be very water soluble, but it is very toxic because in our stomach acids, this does become soluble and is picked up by the blood. Number 2, we believe pottery coming from lead glazes, and especially because the low temperature firing of wood kilns causes the lead not to really seal, and you don't have that hard glassy finish. So not only do we have lead paint, pigments and lead glaze, but we also have it's leachable. And here we have many examples. We've done a good deal of work throughout the world quantifying this, working with countries to try to ban lead glazes. It's a very hard practice. There are 2 sources of lead here: the color, pigments, and the glaze, which is of course a shiny material which fuses the clay and makes that nice surface on it. And when we test this using an XRF or using a leachability sort of test like the lead check, we find that it's quite leachable. So an image like this is truly scary, given that the soup is picking up some of the oxide that's in the glaze, and that's why we believe the median blood lead level in Mexican communities here ranges anywhere from 5 to 15 in these mountainous communities which are doing this pottery. And we have a good deal of data on this. I'll let you digest this. This is maternal habits of lead glaze ceramic use, and the levels that you sort of can expect depending on how frequently they use the pottery. I'll let you stop the video so you could digest this further. Number 3, we believe that the lead poisoning problem is targeting mining and smelting. And we have many cases of this, whether it's La Oroya in Peru, a very well-known case study, or in this particular case we have what's happening in Kabwe in Zambia. But there are literally hundreds and hundreds of abandoned legacy lead mines where there's exposure and very often scavenging and salvaging of lead slag for recycling. So what we see here are people actually mining leftover lead to make a few dollars for sustenance. Number 4, paint coatings and pigments. And yes, this is the classic source. This alligatoring you see on a painted wood frame is very common in the U.S. Fortunately, we've solved this problem because of our regulations and our CDC and HUD and EPA window replacement programs. However, you do not see this image often elsewhere, especially in low and middle income countries. So this is number 4. Number 5, we are putting into the category of other, and other includes pots like this that have used lead as part of a coating, lead and zinc, in this case covering these aluminum pots called darisans in Ghana. We've seen many of these. They're leachable lead. They're not made with lead, but they're coated with zinc and lead as part of that process. Also cosmetics, coal. We have all sorts of traditional medicines. We have statues. We have crucifixes. So this category of other is a catch-all for, again, all the other miscellaneous sources that we see, including consumer products that may have lead. So this is where, again, these are the top 5 in order of what we think has been our experience. This, of course, is not universal in every country. It will be, in some countries, pottery will not be number 1. Mining may be number 1 in another country. But again, short of the U.S., we don't see paint coatings as much as we would have expected. So again, what we have here is risk is a combination of the hazard and the exposure. And so when you just do the math, how many cities sell lead-based paint globally, how many people buy it, again, have the money to buy it, and then how many homes have lead-based paint, and how many of those surfaces are deteriorated. When all of these happen, when you just do the math, you realize that even with a moderate amount of residential lead-based paint being available in hardware stores in Bangladesh, in Ghana, in Zimbabwe, in Bolivia, we just don't have the numbers to sort of explain the high lead poisoning that we see. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, contact Pure Earth or myself at the emails and addresses that we provided. Thank you very much. Goodbye now.